All right, Tynan, welcome to the show, man. Thank you so much for being
Hey,
here.
yeah, my pleasure.
Man, I am so stoked to have you on the show because, I don't know where I heard this, but somebody once called you the most interesting man in the world. And I was like, okay, first of all, sold. Like, let's listen to this. Like, I'm interested. And then I was talking to a friend the other day when I found out that we're going to do this interview. And I was trying to explain who you are. And the story came up about, like, they were asking me, like, what do you mean, like, he's interesting? Like, what does that mean? Like, everyone's interesting. And I was like, no, no, no. Tynan literally sounds like the most interesting man in the world. And they were asking me why. And the story that I used to explain what I meant was I heard that you purchased or attempted to purchase a penguin as a pet once.
Yeah.
Can you tell me that story? And first of all, why did you want to buy a penguin? And like, how did all of that play out?
Yeah, so a friend had sent me this website. It was called penguinwarehouse.com. No context. They just sent it to me, back in the AOL Instant Messenger days. And I click it, and uh, as a kid, I read this book called Mr. Popper's Penguins. I don't know if you've heard of that book, but for my generation, that was like one of the books that every kid read. And it's about this guy who has all these pet penguins in his basement and all this kind of stuff. And I think it just triggered something about that book. And I was like, oh my God, you can buy a penguin. I had no idea that you could do that. And I just like immediately clicked the inventory tab, and it had five or six penguins, like the breed, the age, the weight, all that sort of stuff. Spent hours researching which penguin I wanted. I was going to get the Snares Island penguin. I was going to name him Magellan. I was like I had the whole thing figured out. And so I immediately send them an email. I'm like, hey, I'm ready to buy this penguin. I don't really know anything about penguin raising, but just let me know what I need to do. And I start telling my friends about this. I'm like, I'm buying this penguin. It's going to be amazing. And we happened to be going to Costco to get stuff to make smoothies. And they had this big display where they had this 30-foot diameter swimming pool, like one of those above ground swimming pools. And they had it on its side. So it was sitting like this in the store. And I saw it and I thought, that would be perfect for the penguin because, of course, he'll want to swim. You know, penguins always swim. And so I call my dad, who's, he's like a builder. He knows how to do all this stuff. I say, hey, Dad, is there any reason I couldn't put 3,000 gallon swimming pool in my living room? And he says, Ty, do not do this. You always have these crazy ideas. I tell you not to do them and you still do them, but really don't do this. It's a bad idea. And I was like, well, all right, I'm still going to do it. I'm just not going to tell him about it. So bought the pool, set it up in my living room. It went from one wall to like almost the other wall. So there was like 12 inches you could sort of sneak by the pool. Took 2 days to fill up. It had like a filter, a ladder, like all this sort of stuff. And so I was, sending pictures of this to my family members and my friends. I'm like, look, I'm buying this penguin. Here's the pool it's going to swim in. And my aunt happened to go to, she lives in Boston. She went to the Boston Aquarium. She said, yeah, my nephew, he says he's buying this penguin. And they said, well, that's totally illegal. There's no possible way he's buying a penguin. It's not real. And she told me that. And I was like, oh, that's really weird. I mean, yeah, I guess they haven't written me back yet. And I kept sending it to people. And one person, they're like, you sound like you're being serious about this, but you know this site is a joke, right? It's like, what makes you think that? And very clearly on the front page, which I had totally skipped, it was like an April Fool's joke. I mean, like none of it seemed real at all. So yeah, so I never got the penguin, but that story is what made my blog popular.
So what happened with the pool? Like, did you like take it down? Did you like leave it up?
Yeah, so it was mostly for the penguin, but in the back of my head, I thought like, how baller is this to have an indoor swimming pool? I'm like 20 years old. Like whoever thought that would happen? And I just hadn't thought it through, and it never occurred to me that the water in the pool would never become warmer than the house air, right? Like obviously this makes sense, but I just never thought it through. And so it was really cold. So I went swimming 2 or 3 times in it, and it is a very bizarre feeling to be like lying on one of those pool floats, looking up at your ceiling fan, like a very bizarre feeling. But eventually, the other problem with it is that it was just a thin layer of vinyl on the outside. It was this inflatable ring, and as you
Mm-hmm.
filled it, the ring lifted the top, but the walls were just this single layer of vinyl. So as I would sleep, I would like hear something shift, and I would think, "Oh God, my house is flooding." I would run out, eyes closed, sort of like you with your alarm that you were telling me about earlier, and I just put my hand around it to see if it was wet. And so I was actually about to go on my first cruise, and it was a week, and I thought, there's no way I'm going to enjoy this cruise if I have the swimming pool in my living room and I'm worried about it exploding. So back then I lived in this house, and my backyard, between my backyard and my neighbor's backyard was this like dry creek sort of thing that in like a big storm, I guess water would go through it. And so I siphoned the water out there, and it, takes hours. I mean, this thing was, I forget how many thousands of gallons, but it was a huge, maybe 16,000 gallon pool or something. And as I'm doing this, there's a knock at my door, and I open the door, and it's this guy, and I sort of crack it open because I don't know who it is. And he's like, "Hey man, like I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but you have a massive leak in your house. It's just flooding the easement. I'm your neighbor in the back, and I see it out my back door." And I don't know why, but I just like, I don't know. I just sort of, I'm like, "Oh, it's just my swimming pool." And I open up the door, and he looks at it, and you can tell, like, you can see the switch flip in his head where he's like, "Oh, this guy's a psycho." And he's like, "Oh yeah, okay. Oh well, good. No problem. I guess everything's fine. Nice to meet you. Yep. See you." And yeah, and then actually I returned it to Costco after that because they had a return policy, and actually the one that they had on display had double walls, which looked a lot more sturdy. And so I cart the thing in on this big like dolly, and I'm like, "Hey, I need to return this pool. I bought it as an environment for my penguin, but I thought it was gonna be double walled. It was only single walled." And the guy looks at me. He's like, "Wait, are you being serious right now?" I was like, "Yeah." And he's like, "I need to get my manager." And he gets his manager, and his manager's like, "All right, man. Yeah, we'll take it back, I guess." So yeah, that was
Dude,
it.
Costco is insane with that. My dad has a story about a friend of ours was moving to a new house and didn't want to take his like really nice barbecue with him.
Hmm.
So he just like gave it to my dad or whatever. It had some missing pieces or something. And my dad went to Costco and was like, "Hey, like, there was this model. I need like a few pieces that are broken and missing. I just want to replace them." And the guy told him like, "Well, we don't actually sell this model anymore, but if you want to, you can like return your grill and we'll give you full refund and you can buy a new one." And my dad was like, "It's like 8 years old. I don't have a receipt, whatever." They're like, "Doesn't matter. We were the only people that sold this. So just return it." My dad got like
Wow.
full for it. So my dad was immediately like, "Everything ever I'm buying from Costco, like no questions asked." So
Seriously. Wow.
yeah, Costco's the man. So um, you mentioned in passing there that all of this Magellan, penguin buying in your house, setting up a pool, all happened when you were about 20 years old. So
Yeah.
can you, just for anybody who's listening, who's maybe not familiar with you, not every 20-year-old can afford or be in a position to even consider buying a penguin, although I think a lot of 20-year-olds would be like, "I want a penguin." What were you doing at the time that made it possible for you to even consider and go through the process of buying a penguin, even if they were fake?
Yeah. So back then, I think from probably when I was 17 to my early 20s, I was a professional gambler for not poker back then, but online gambling. I basically found some loopholes in some online casinos, and then just randomly found sort of another 100 or so people that were doing the same thing as me and created this whole community where we shared our tips and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, that really supported my life for like, yeah, I don't know, 5 years, maybe around there.
And you had at this time, you dropped out of college, right? So you were already doing this in school and then you dropped out of school to kind of pursue it full time, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm a fellow college dropout. And so I always think it's
I,
really interesting when I find other people who've done it. What was like the biggest problem for you dropping out? Because for me, for example, I'm an immigrant. So my parents, I grew up constantly being told, "Hey, we're moving to this country so that you can get a good education." So when I dropped out of college, I basically had to say, like, "Hey, mom and dad, thanks for completely changing your lives around. But I'm going to actually not do the thing that you moved here to do." So did you have any sort of like big, uh, you know, chasms to cross in that way? And how did you like, deal with it?
yeah, I mean, I had a very similar sort of thing where uh, my grandparents on my mother's side were first generation immigrants. My mother was, I think, the first person in my family to get a college degree. She went to Columbia. So, like, essentially all she cares about are college degrees and grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, I, I knew all along I would never graduate college. I had zero interest in it. I knew that it didn't lead to any path that I personally wanted to go down, which isn't to say it isn't a great path for some people, but just for me, I knew it wasn't. But I also knew that I couldn't just drop out and do nothing. So I had to have some other plan. Um, and so I knew that my parents, particularly my mother, would take it really poorly, but it wasn't even a question for me because I just knew I was going to do it eventually. So in my mind, it was like, okay, I need to be able to justify it to myself, and then I can justify it to her, and we'll see. What was interesting is that my mother and I have always had a pretty good relationship, but we really butted heads a lot on school because it was a top priority for her, lowest priority for me. And it was sort of the only thing we fought about, but we fought about it all the time because I wouldn't do my homework. I never once studied for a test. It's not like I was a genius and I did well. I just didn't study. I did poorly, and I didn't care. Like to me, grades just didn't matter. And my mom, it was like that was how well I was doing in life.
Mm.
So the funny thing was, when I dropped out, I think she wouldn't speak to me for like a month or so. Like it was pretty bad. But since then, our relationship it made our relationship perfect because we had nothing to argue about anymore after she saw that I was going to be okay.
And how did you said after she saw that you were going to be okay, how did you either show that or how did you make her feel better about that?
It took a while because I mean back then, you know, I think I wasn't that good at looking at things from other people's perspectives. And so in my mind, I'm like, I'm doing great with gambling. This is going to give me more time to gamble. I'm going to make more money. It's perfect. Thinking about it from my mom's perspective now, it's like, wow, what's worse than that? Like your kid is like, I'm dropping out of school to gamble. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I know everything about this. And if I had a kid and they told me they were going to do that, I would be pissed. So I get it. Um, in fact, when I told her, I was like, hey, mom, just want you to know, I just dropped out of school. You know, and she's like, she was so pissed. She's like, you have to undo it. I'm like, and specifically when I went in there to meet them, they were trying to get me to take with the counselors. They said, take a year off. I said, no, I want you to make this permanent so I can't go back. Like, I really want to burn the bridge. And so I told my mom that, and she was so upset. She's like, all right, well, you go gamble or whatever it is you're going to do. Like, that was the issue, right? But once she saw, like, that I was fine, that I was making money, that I was, I didn't ask her for money or anything like that, I think she realized that I was going to be okay.
Mm.
And it was probably a gradual process, but I remember maybe about a year after I dropped out, one of the big things with gambling is that per name, like in my name, I could only make so much money. But if I could get a friend to let me also gamble under their name and they would give their IDs and all that, pretend it was them, I could double my money. And so that was sort of how we scaled, was having multiple names. And after about a year, my parents offered to let me use their names,
Oh, and that
which
was like the
that was a big one. Yeah.
yeah.
And,
So
and,
it's
and
interesting. Go ahead.
oh, I was going to say, and sort of before that, this is another thing that I always like to bring up because I think maybe I make my parents sound like bad people, or not bad people, but like the antagonists in that story.
Mm-hmm.
What was pretty amazing to me is that when I was born, my grandparents invested some money in the stock market, and it was like a college fund for me. And obviously, having dropped out and having gone to a public school, there was still some money left, maybe 20,000, or I can't remember what it was. And my parents gave it to me. So after like I was dropped out for 6 months, they were like, look, we still have this college money for you. We know you're going to use it for gambling, but like, hey, it's your money. We'll give it to you, which blew my
Mm.
mind because I thought it really showed that like, even though they disagreed with my decision, they still supported me. And I think
Yeah.
that's actually been a pretty significant factor in my success in life, I think.
It's interesting because you almost dropped out in the complete opposite way that I did, where I actually sold it to my parents as, hey, I'm just taking a year off, even though in the back of my head, I was kind of like, I probably am not going to go back. And so I kind of sold it to them as like, hey, worst case scenario in a year, I can go back, but I'm most likely not going to. So that's interesting. And the other thing for anybody who's listening that's maybe younger and thinking about this, what really, I mean, just by sheer luck, I was reading at the time How to Make Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, or whatever that title is.
Yeah.
And that book really helped me realize, tried to like, I put myself in my parents' shoes and was like, why do my parents want me to go to college? What is the end goal of this? And so then when I approached it to them of like, hey, I know that you really want me to go to school because you want me to be happy and to live a good life, but here's why I'm still going to do that even if I don't go to school. And I think that that really helped. I mean, it's not like it was easy for my parents, but I think that that really helped them sort of, like accept my decision, so to say.
I think that's
So
a much
that was,
smarter way to do it.
it was luck of the draw. I
Yeah.
just rolled the dice on that one. But so you mentioned that you were gambling at the time. And if anyone's heard of you before, you, I think, gained some notoriety very early on from being featured in the book The Game, which probably a lot of people have heard of or read. And what I'm curious about, and I know that you've talked a lot about your experience in that world and in gambling, but I'm curious now, as somebody who runs a business and works for themselves, what are some of the lessons that you'd say you've taken from both gambling and kind of the pickup scenes, quote unquote, to call it that, that you now use on a day-to-day basis? What are some of those lessons that you've learned from those experiences that have moved on with you?
Sure, yeah, good question. So I think a lot of my, I think there's a lot of my success that's just like, hey, I was in a good family, had good support, all that sort of stuff. I think in terms of what I contributed to it, I think a lot of it comes from the gambling days. I think humans in general are terrible at assessing risk. I think there's about a zillion examples of that if you just look at the COVID crisis. Um, and I think people are really bad at understanding probabilities as well. So, like, what is a 1 in a million? How often does that happen, right? If you're doing something a certain amount of times per day, how often does that happen? Uh, you know, for 7 years, I lived that. Like, my entire life was risk management. It was looking at these probabilities in both ways. Like, I hit lots of royal flushes on video poker, which is the kind of like thing that seems like a once in a lifetime and can't happen, but you realize it does. I've also had terrible losing streaks that other people might attribute to, something else when really it's just the odds. So I think that if I were to like give myself credit for anything, I think that I'm really good at making decisions. I think I'm just a really excellent decision maker. And I think a lot of that goes back to that those gambling days of like being very good at assessing risk and understanding probabilities. Especially I later moved on to poker, and I think that builds on it too, where you're taking um, a lot of ranges, a lot of imprecise information, and you distill it down to a concrete decision.
Mm.
Pickup, I think, also does the same sort of thing, right? When you're dealing with another human, whether it's a woman you're trying to date or just anybody, you can't precisely know what they're thinking, where they are in life, what their values are, but you can think about the ranges of that and think about what you can do that will, most align with all of that. And of course, there's also some risk management involved in pickup as well. But I think the biggest thing I learned from pickup is, um, well, it's sort of like what you're talking about with your parents. Like, I didn't even think about how my parents felt about it, to be honest. Like, it just didn't cross my mind, and that's sort of embarrassing to say, but it's true. Um, when you get really good at pickup, essentially what you're doing is you're building. I think of it as almost having another person's simulator in my head. And so before I say something, I understand how it's going to affect that person. And I understand what that person cares about, what they want, why they're in this interaction. And it's not like I'm thinking about this in a calculating way, but I just know, right?
Mm-hmm. You've
And
done
it
it
doesn't
so
mean
many
I can
times. You've done it so many times. It's almost like intuitive, like muscle memory in a way.
exactly. And it doesn't mean I'm just going to say whatever they want to hear, but I'm not going to say something they don't want to hear. You know what I mean? Like,
Mm.
I'm not like, for example, if there's somebody who's really polite, I'm not going to say something really rude. I'm going to stay within, the polite. So, uh, I was a big introvert. I didn't think much about other people. I think really didn't have a lot of compassion, mainly because I think I didn't consider other people's perspectives largely, and so I think that it helped me a lot with that.
When you talk about the, sort of like the risk assessment, I totally agree with you. As I think a lot of people aren't very good at that and almost consider some risks bigger than they are. Like the way that I've heard it
Absolutely.
explained is like, we still have our monkey brain and we think that there's always a tiger around the corner. Wow. In fact,
Mhm.
like the thing around the corner is actually not that scary, right? It's not gonna kill you. What are some ways that people can like practice this or improve this risk management or assessment? I'm not a gambler. I've never understood, for example, like cards or poker or any of these things. Like, don't come to me, and like I don't
Mhm.
necessarily want to go learn how to play cards. But if I were to want to improve that and sort of learn some of the skills that you've learned from poker, what would be some of, or gambling in general? What are some things that people can do to like train and improve that in their lives?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the best way is to just learn poker, to be honest. Like, I think even if you don't care about poker, you don't want to make money with poker, it what's nice about poker is that it forces you to stand behind your assessments, right? So if somebody says like, well, that'll never happen, it's like, okay, well, what are the odds and how much money are you trying to put on that?
Mm,
So it it's sort of like an unavoidable crash course. That's something that poker and pickup both have in common, is that you're subjected to frequent, honest feedback, right? If a girl doesn't like you, you're going to know, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're making bad assessments at poker, you're going to know because you're going to lose money in the long run. Um, so I think even for people who don't care about poker, if you're serious about it, I think that is sort of the training course for it.
Mm.
If you don't want to do that, I think there's a few small practices that you can do. One is that when you make an assertion, you record it and you record the odds that you think it's going to happen. So for example, if you say, well, that, I don't think that's going to happen. It's like, okay, is it 100% not going to happen? Is it 66% not going to happen? And you record these, and then you record whether it happened or not. And then using math, you could figure out how accurate you are, and it'll show whether you are overestimating probabilities, underestimating probabilities. Another easy one is with your friends, you can make bets. So I wouldn't say I have this with all of my friends, but with a lot of my friends, we sort of have a standing agreement that if you make an assertion, you're willing to back it up at some level,
Mm.
right? So, for example, a year ago when COVID hit, my friend and I were talking about how it was going to affect the stock market. Neither of us really, at the time, especially invested in the stock market, but we made a bet. He said, "Well, I think it's going to crash." I said, "I think it's going to be higher than it is today." So he's like, "All right, let's bet." And you can't say no, because if you say no, that means that you didn't really believe in what you said.
Right.
And if you know that you're going to have to make these bets, it forces you to do that extra work of like, what are the possibilities? What are the likelihoods?
Hmm. It's actually interesting that you say that, because my wife, one of the things that she does when we talk about it is like when she challenges something that I say, she'll go like, how percent sure are you on this? And I need to be
Great
like,
idea.
70%, and it's like, oh, so you're
Mhm.
not 100% sure on this. So
Mhm.
I've always kind of been like, why do you have to do that? But, it might be a positive kind of thing. So,
It's really valuable because most people make terrible assertions all the time, but then when they're correct, they remember that one. And
right,
so,
right.
most people think that they're better at it than they are.
Mm.
That's why, a few years ago, I wrote a blog post of, I think it's actually coming due next year, of what I think is going to happen in 5 years for me. And then I put percentages to all of them. So in a year, I'll get to see how accurate I was.
Do you remember what some of the things that you like wanted for yourself in 5 years were?
Yeah, I think that I know one of the big ones back then, it was before I was married. And so I thought 80% chance I would be married or in like a very long-term marriage like sort of thing. But
Mm-hmm.
I said 80%. And actually one of my readers bet me.
Oh,
And he
really?
actually already, yeah, and he already paid me. And so I'm trying to think what else. I think some of them were sort of more general, like I think I'm still going to live in Vegas, 90%. Um, yeah, I can't remember. It's going to be interesting to look at it. It was 5 years ago, and I basically only remember the wife one because that guy bet me, and he to his big credit, he contacted me. He's like, "Hey, looks like I lost. I'll pay you."
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So I know that you're an author. You have several books out that people can check out on Amazon. Specifically, you have two, I think, that are like your biggest ones, the one about habits and also social skills. I know that you do some coaching as well. And I know that you dabble with coding, but I'm curious to learn more about like what is your day-to-day business? Like how do you make your income, so to say?
Yeah. I feel like I never, I feel like it changes month by month. I mean, if you asked
Sure.
me this a year ago, my biggest thing is I built a website called cruisesheet.com. I love cruises, and it's by far the best cruise booking site. So it started as like a list for me, and it turned into a cruise agency. Um, so that used to be my biggest thing I made money on, not anymore. Um, I do coaching. I've stopped taking new people. I took a bunch more during COVID, and now that travel is going to start again, I'm not taking any more. I do live events, which are sort of a similar sort of thing. Books used to be my biggest thing I make money on. I'm also pretty frugal. I've saved up a lot of money. I invested some in crypto. So, at this point, investments and interest on that are sort of creeping up. Uh, I don't have a strong day-to-day schedule, to be honest with you. I wake up, I have tea, I check my email, I try to knock one important thing out so that I can lock in the day's been win. Um, but yeah, I just kind of do whatever I feel like doing. Sometimes it's coding, sometimes going through a database, sometimes it's drinking tea with my friends. I think in my sort of early 30s, I was very hardcore about worked like 18 hours a day, that kind of thing. And now I'm maybe on the other side of things.
I mean, I think hearing that, a lot of people are going to be like, dude, Tynan's living the life, right? You get to wake up, do whatever you want, you know,
100% true.
work on the projects that you want to work on. So how were you able to get to that point? I mean, was it just money that you were able to save up from your gambling days and invest it intelligently in them? Or what do you think are like maybe like the three important things that you did that got you to that point?
Yeah. So actually, at the end of my gambling days, all of my money was stolen. So I had six figures saved up that if I had just invested it in like the most boring thing, it would be worth millions today for sure.
So you walked
But
away from gambling with you technically started from zero after gambling.
yeah, I got, yeah, I mean, I think that I had zero. And then luckily, by a crazy freak stroke of luck, a casino sent a check to somebody whose name I was playing under for $30,000, which, it's a lot of money. It's about the biggest check anybody's ever gotten. And I didn't even know they got the check, right? Because like I was done with it. And like months later, like the casinos were always very slow to pay. And it was for a royal flush I hit. And she was she was not a wealthy person. And she called me. She said, "Hey, I got this check for you." And I had zero, like literally zero. I went from having, six figures saved up to zero. And I mean, I had some equity in my house, so it wasn't like, but anyway. And I said, "That's amazing. Okay, give me this money." So she gives me the money. And then she calls me a week later and she's like, "Hey, they canceled the check and the bank wants me to pay it back." And so I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, well, so basically the casino canceled the check, but her bank had already paid her. And
Uh,
she's like, "So, they're asking me for the money back." And so in my mind, I'm like, "All right, I'll give it back to her." It's like, this isn't her problem. And she's like, "But don't worry, I worked at a bank. I know they can't do that. I'll fight them. They'll never get it from me." So that was like what gave me the breathing room. And that's how I started writing books, because I had some time to kind of breathe. Yeah.
that's so
Um,
interesting. But what
yeah.
about
But
like, yeah, so what do you think are those like like let's say like I'm sure it wasn't just like one big landfall, right? So like what do you
right.
think are like the three important things that happened that got you to the point where you're at now?
So I think I think there's really one big one and then maybe a few others.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest one is that I really lived below my means. And I think people like think they're living below their means, but like I lived in an RV behind a gas station, right? I lived in an RV for 7 years. And
That's
I
cool now.
calculate it's cool. I was one of, like, when I did it, nobody did it. I mean, I'm sure maybe some people did, but they didn't write about it. But like when I did it, people thought I was a total psychopath. Like people thought that was really weird. Like only old people do that. And like no friends, nobody, there was no reference point for it. And I calculated when I sold my RV. First of all, I sold it for profits. I sold it for twice what I paid for it, although I did put some money into it. But I calculated that I saved $150,000 in rent over those years. And I didn't like spend that $150,000 on other stuff. Like I saved it and I invested it, right? And so I think people like to talk about living below their means, but I don't think anybody really does it.
Mm-hmm.
For many years I ate a one pot meal that I invented. It was lentils, quinoa, a bunch of vegetables, olive oil, coconut oil, and some spices. And it must have cost like $1. And that's all I ate every day. I just ate that. So I really lived below my means, saved money, and I invested it. I think I'm a very good investor, not in stock markets, but in terms of like I invested in friends' businesses, I invested in real estate, I invested in crypto, stuff like that. And so even as my income went up, with when I had huge months with my blog or with my books, or people would hire me to speak or something like that, I if I had any windfall, I never spent it. That just went straight to
Mm-hmm.
investments, right? Even I don't even know how much my income or net worth has gone up, but multiplied many times from those times. Probably my spending's gone up like 10%. You know what I mean? I eat one meal a day and it's Chipotle. So I think that like
Every
I
day?
think that yeah, my wife doesn't like Chipotle that much. So probably one, last night we had tacos. So which I guess is not that different from Chipotle. Once or twice a week, I'd say I have one meal with my wife that's not Chipotle. But like if she's out of town or something, Chipotle every day. I don't even think about it. Um,
That is my wife's dream. I would have to
Really?
say is
All right,
would
let's
be
switch
like
wives then. This is
eating.
perfect.
Well, listen, man, I also like Chipotle, so it's
Okay, good.
okay. But so Okay, there's so many places that I can go from there, but one of the things that I am very interested to learn about, or I think that you've done a good job of, is I've heard you talk about the fact that you, at an early age, had the experience of having a lot of money and realizing that it doesn't actually take all that much money to be happy. Right.
For
And so I
sure.
think a lot of us end up kind of wanting to have a lot of money in order to then say, like, and then I'll do whatever it is that I want to do. What do you think people can do in order to not necessarily have to jump through the hoop of like earning it and then live in a way that, like, okay, I've earned it, I know that I don't actually need that much money, so I can be happy without making as much? Or do you think that you just need to have that experience? Because even though, like, I understand that personally, like, I think I'm a little bit, like, not necessarily that I've had a lot of money, but I know a lot of people who have. And I know that, like, that's not necessarily what makes them happy. So I've gotten to see that firsthand. But what do you think are some things that people can do in order to have a kind of like have that realization? Because I think a lot of people know that, but they don't really like act on that, or they don't really like fully believe it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to fully believe until you experience it. And of course, I only had, I had this weird experience where I had a lot of money, and then it took, I probably didn't have that much money again for a decade or something, right? So I think it's unusual to have that experience. But I think, something that we all know is true is, are there people that are 10 or 100 times richer than you who are miserable?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, right? Like, if anybody wants to say no to that, then let's argue about it. But for sure, that is true, right? I think that's like an empirical truth. And then, are there people poorer than all of us who are very happy? The answer is also really true. One interesting experience I had is I went to Dominican Republic and Haiti. They share that island,
Mm-hmm.
and it felt to me, and whatever. I was there for a week, so who knows? But it felt to me like nobody in the DR was happy. Like, everybody like felt like it just had this overwhelming feeling that, like, people were poor and they knew it and they wanted to be rich, and they were like clawing to become rich, which, I think there's some nice things about that too. But it just had this, like, I felt like everybody was like trying to take advantage. Then I
Mm-hmm.
went to Haiti, and far poorer than DR, right? Like, I stayed it was the only time I ever did, or the first time I did, couch surfing. And I stayed with this family, and their front door was a hole in a concrete wall, like, didn't close. They had one light bulb in this house, very poor, and they were so happy. And they were just like the nicest people. They had all these friends. And it really, really threw into contrast how I was like, okay, these people are way happier than the people that I've met in the DR, right? Or at least
Mm-hmm.
at some level. And they're also way poorer. Um, so I think, like, we all know it's true. And I think it's just like internalizing. That said, having a lot of money is great, right? I think that, like, people think that it's like, it does make your life easier, and I think it increases your opportunity. I also think it really does increase your opportunity to make other people happy,
Mm-hmm.
and which can make you happy. So I do think it makes you happier, but I think it's like one of the least important factors in making you happy. Something I've also noticed, just in terms of coaching a lot of people, seeing myself, seeing my friends, is that most everybody has this idea. I think it's like $1 million. People think, once I have $1 million, like, everything's going to change. The point at which I think things actually change are when you can make enough money that you have control over your time again. For me, I only had to make about 1,500 bucks a month. I was living in my RV, and I remember, like, once I knew that I could make 1,500 bucks a month on average, pretty reliably, with like my blog or my books, the weight of the world was off my shoulders. I was like, great, I can live like this forever. I have all of my time back. I can work on bigger things. I can spend time with people. And I've seen other people cross that threshold. Now, for some people, maybe it's 2,000, 3,000, or maybe it's like, hey, once you have 100K in the bank, you can sort of live off the interest, or that gives you enough runway for 20-year runway or something. So I think that really does increase happiness, I think, when people get to that point.
Yeah, I mean, there's also there's interesting research. I believe it was from Purdue University that actually gave it a number that said, like, how much money does it take to be happy, and like where's the the middle zone, because essentially what they said is like there's a lot of, like you said, rich people who are unhappy, and then there's, obviously if you don't have enough money to put food on the table or to pay your bills, and that's a constant stressor for you, that's obviously going to affect your happiness. And so it was interesting, what they cited was about I think it was like 75 to $95,000 a year for a single person, and then a family of four. So like if you are married and you have two kids, it's about $200,000, where they found that, like, where most people report being happiest. And the other thing, like, so for example, I started a community for people who, in order to try to achieve that. And we focus on three things. It's owning a business, because I think that gives you the most power over your life and kind of the direction of your life. Being location dependent, because I know you travel a lot, obviously, that there's a lot of benefits that come with that, and getting to that $100,000 minimum kind of spot in your income. So those are like the three things that we talk about. Is there something else beyond that that you think is another really important milestone like that you found, will bring you greater happiness and enjoyment in life?
Well, I guess one thing I would say about that is that I believe the stat with the 70,000, 90,000, whatever, but I also think that something I always think about with those sorts of studies is, you know, everybody, on average, an average isn't you, especially if you have an exceptional life, whether it's good or bad, exceptional. That probably doesn't apply to you, right? Probably your point is somewhere else on that map. So like, I think the difference for me, back when I lived in my RV, especially, like the difference in going from like 0 to like 3,000 was enormous. To go from 3,000 to like 6,000 or whatever is essentially nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that uh, I absolutely would encourage everybody who's interested to own a business. I think, shooting for 100K is good. Although I think it's more interesting to focus on net worth personally than income, because it's a little more permanent. But I would also say, if you can lower your costs and live below your means, first of all, I think it's fun in some ways to do so, but you might get there like 5 years earlier. And I think once you do get to that point, you have no stress, you have your runway, you have your time. And so I think especially if you're working on your business, you can explore more stuff, you can take a longer view of it, which is usually better.
Yeah, it's my friend Dan Andrews has this really interesting concept where he talks about the stair steps in life in terms of finances. And one of the things that he talked about is, going from like being $60,000 in debt from school to being actually like broke is huge. And then the
For
next
sure.
huge one is like having $10,000 in the bank, because that $10,000 at that moment gives you so much security. But that
Yep.
10,000, for example, like the next step up would be way, way, way bigger, because you never really, like, you need a lot more money to feel that sort of, um, for money to have that much of an impact on your life again.
Definitely true. Yeah. I mean, the metric I always think of it in is how long is your runway, right? Like, if I had a 1 month runway, I would be flipping out. Like, I don't know what I would be doing. I'd be out hustling, right? Once you get like a 1 year, 2 year runway, you can start to breathe a little bit. What's interesting to me is when you cross that threshold to unlimited runway. And
Mm-hmm.
there's different ways you can do it. Maybe it's a passive business. Maybe you wrote a book. Maybe you just saved up enough money, and there are so many opportunities to earn decent interest these days, and you can just live off the interest. Whatever it is, once you hit unlimited runway, like, your life is yours, right? You're no
Mm-hmm.
longer working for other people. You're working for yourself because you don't have to work. And I find that switch to be the most interesting one. And I agree, there are other ones that are also really interesting. But to me, that's like 10 times more impactful than any other. Although I also have never been in debt, so I could see that being maybe on par,
Mm-hmm.
going from debt to zero.
How do you deal though with, and this is a very like first world problems and sort of a privileged question to ask, but how do you deal with a place where you have unlimited opportunities to choose from? And to sort of explain my question, when I was maybe in my early 20s, I was very confused about what I wanted to do with my life. I think it's something that a lot of people in their 20s kind of deal with, is like, I have so many things that I could choose from. There are so many things that I could do with my life that you get overwhelmed with deciding what to do. And I had a conversation with my mom, and it was really interesting because my parents grew up during the Soviet Union. And so the thing she said was, she was like, we had no options. Like it was, hey, you're going to go
Right.
do this and that's all you're going to go do, right? Like you didn't really have many choices to pick from. And while what all they wanted at the time was the ability to have a choice, the ability to have the freedom to pursue whatever they wanted to pursue, she said, looking back and seeing what I was going through, in some ways, she feels like maybe it made their life easier, not having to go through what I was going through. Not that communism made life easy on them, but they never had to deal with that. They had fewer choices.
Right.
So, obviously, if you're in a position where you have unlimited runway, you have money in the bank, you can do anything that you want to do. I feel like that feeling would be even more exponential. So, how do you deal with having all of these opportunities and all of these choices that you can make? How do you make sure, like, how do you pick which direction to go into?
Yeah. So I don't worry about it. I mean, that's the short answer is that like if I didn't have unlimited runway, I would pick anything. I would give myself a week. I would pick something and I would just do it, right? Until I got to that point. Once you're past it, it's like, okay, at this point you're probably the concept of EV, expected value, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
which decision, for example, in the long run is going to be more beneficial would be an easy way to say it. I think the highest EV move is actually just to let yourself go down different paths and find out what you really connect with and then do it or do nothing. Like at that point, if you don't want to do anything, fine. I think I think the way society is structured, we feel like we have to be doing something at all times, right? But like if you're starting yet another like SEO business, like is that really a net positive? Like, does it matter that you're doing that? You know what I mean? So I think the process I usually lead people through, because I think this is a common problem people have, is I think, where do you want your life to go in 5 years? Like, what do you want it to look like? For some people, that's business success. Other people, it's they want a family. Other people, it's they want more time with their friends or whatever. They want to travel. And then I think, what is it going to take to get there? And even if you don't know exactly, as you're sort of evaluating things to do, you can look at it through the lens of like, does this have some reasonable chance of going there? Does it have any chance of going there? Um, and yeah, I just wouldn't worry about it. I think that we're just ingrained to worry about what we're doing. We feel like we have to be doing something at all times. I think a lot of people, when I see, for example, my friend Nick Gray, he had a family business. His parents started from nothing. It's called Flight Display Systems, and they were doing like the electronics for private jets and military helicopters and stuff like that, right? They did well, worked on it for many years, sold it. My friend didn't have to do anything. And so he got into museums. He just, he was never into museums. He lived in New York, fell in love with the Met Museum. And then I remember he decided to start this business called Museum Hack. And he's like, I think I'm never going to make a profit on this business. I think I'm going to always lose money, but I just love it. And I'm going to do tours of the Met because I just want it to exist. He sold that business for, I don't know how much, but some large amount many years later. So I think that often, and it was very fulfilling for him too, right? Like I'm sure he learned a lot and enjoyed making flight display systems, but I think, the Met thing really was great for him and it was creating something new that was valuable to other people. So I think if you look at the long term, just do what you want to do.
Yeah, I follow Nick on Instagram. Nick Gray
Oh, cool.
News, I think, is his
That's right.
username.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I will say, you know, he leads one of these lives that I'm very personally like not jealous of, but I'm like, oh, it looks like he's always having so much fun. Like it looks like he is like really enjoying himself, like doing kind of whatever he wants to. And I think that that's what like we all want to get to. That's kind of like what we all
Mm-hmm.
strive to, is to have this like, I think unfortunately far too many people, they want that, but they get stuck in this like rat race, right? Of like they forget that they've earned enough to have that, and they forget to
Mm-hmm.
kind of jump off the rat race. So they get kind of like on autopilot. What are some ways that you would say have like enabled you? Like, what are some things that you do, for example, that you feel like, that like when you're living your life like this, like what are some of the ways that you enjoy to like have fun like that? Because like I have caught myself getting in that rat race a little bit as well, even though I'm very focused on like building my business and that kind of stuff. I've noticed that like I'm not taking enough time to enjoy the journey. So what are some ways that you would suggest people to like look like to build into their race to like, enjoy it more and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so a couple things. So I think one is that what often happens is people, to get from like say nothing to having unlimited runway, just to use an example.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a certain mindset, a certain set of habits, and you just become this person, you know, that gets you to that point, right? You have a mode
Mm-hmm.
that you're in and it gets you to that point. I think people, and you become good at it, or you wouldn't have gotten there, right? And what I think people forget is that what got you to point A isn't necessarily what's also going to get you to point B. And that's compounded, that's especially difficult because you've become good at this and it's become your identity. And you're like, oh, I've got to start over and switch to a different mode to get to point B. Let me just stay in the safe zone and keep doing what I already know I'm good at. So I think very often when you see people that are just chasing business for the sake of chasing it, when very clearly they're missing out on other things in life, I think that's often what's happening. I think another thing to think about is that there are these projects where they ask people like on their deathbed or really old people like, what do you regret? Nobody ever regrets nobody ever regrets not making more money. Never happens. Nobody says, oh, I wish I worked harder, made more money. Never.
Mm-hmm.
Which is weird. You'd think that would come up sometimes. Almost everybody has regrets about spending time with people they love. Almost universal. So I think that it's like worth thinking like, what makes me so different that that's not going to be how I think? And it's not just a rhetorical question. I think it is worth thinking about. Like, am I different enough, or do I have the same human needs that everybody else has? Um, I've seen people that have become very rich and neglected their friends and family in the process, and they have very hollow. I don't know about sad, but yeah, maybe sad lives, right? Where you
Mm-hmm.
can tell that they're like they have nobody to share it with, they have no peers, and they have to start making friends then, which is hard because you can only make friends with other rich people, basically,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because otherwise, maybe the people are using you, and you don't have that rich history that you might have. Like one of my oldest friends, we've been friends since we were 4 years old. You know what I mean? And so I think focusing on friendships, focusing on friend groups, focusing on investing time and energy in those friendships makes sense. Same with family. I think, you know, if you're totally poor and you can't support yourself, focus on that first. But once you get to where you're self-sufficient, start investing in relationships.
Do you have any sort of systems that like you use to make sure that you're always checking in and making sure that you're not like just going down on like autopilot?
Not really. I mean, I do think I have enough time that I think about those things, but it's not like a good system. Probably it might be beneficial to have one. I do have like certain rules where it's like almost as a rule, I don't travel unless it's with friends, but I travel two
Mm-hmm.
thirds of the year. You know what I mean? Or I usually do. So that helps me check in. I build systems like buying all these properties with my friends, which it forces us to hang. Like in the past few months, I've hung out with two different friend groups in Hawaii and it would have never happened if we didn't buy that place. So when I make decisions, I do think about it through that lens of like, yeah, I have goals to make more money, but I don't really care about those goals. It drives some of my more financially minded friends nuts that I don't capitalize on some stuff. But I do really care about how do I strengthen friendships I care about strengthening? How do I make my friends better friends with each other? How do I spend more time with family and make those connections better? And so
Mm-hmm.
whenever I'm making a decision, those are the lenses through which I look. Even when I think about making more money, my life basically can't get any better. So I think if I make more money, can I use that to achieve those friendship goals? Like, can I, for example, the one goal I have is I want to buy a yacht, which probably won't happen for a long time, but I'd like to buy a yacht so I could take like my family on a private cruise. Like, how cool would that be? Think about the memories we could share and stuff like that.
That is a dream that you share with my dad, and it's actually funny because
Right?
my dad is a longtime sailor, and that's always been the thing. Is like he wants to buy a yacht, he wants to work on it, he wants to like go like sail around the world. And actually, I just
Yeah.
had a conversation with him this morning. He called me up and he was like, "Hey, we have a chance to take this yacht for like 7 to 14 days this summer, go through like the Greek islands. Like, are you game?" And it's interesting because I would normally say no, because I think I'm going to be busy and I could use that money to like reinvest in like business and that kind of stuff. But it's something that I've noticed that I struggle with is like enjoying the time, like we talked about, like enjoying the process of going through it. And I said, like, you know what? Like, yeah, like I'm down, like, let's do this.
Right.
So, yeah, I definitely think that that's, if you do need help with that, I think that that's another person that you can nerd out with on like figuring out how to do that.
Nice.
But you mentioned your you're buying, your apartment in Hawaii and that you buy property all over the world with your friends. And this is something that when I found out that you do this really fascinated me and really got my curiosity going. Can you talk about like how you came up with that idea and how exactly does it work? Like, how is it that you can like buy properties all over the world with your friends? What does the sort of like plan look like?
Yeah. So in the same way that like back when I was living in an RV, I was like, everybody should be doing this, and everybody else is like, you're a total psycho. I think buying property with friends is that's how I feel about it now. Where I'm like, everybody should be doing this, and I think it's going to be popular later on. I think the way it really started, like the prototype for it, was when I was a freshman in college. I watched this movie called Road Trip, where it used to be my favorite movie. One of the things they do is they steal a little school bus and they go on a road trip on it. My friends and I really liked road trips. And I saw this. I'm like, guys, we need to buy a school bus. Like, how fun would this be? And so, to make a long story short, we put it together and we actually bought a school bus. And we bought a huge school bus, 40-foot school bus. And everybody thought this was going to be a disaster. This was another one where I told my dad about it. And he's like, the classic dad line. He's like, you never listen to me, but trust me, this is really going to be a bad idea. And again, to his credit, I bought it anyway. And the next day he was there with tools to help us fix it up. So like, it's pretty cool. And what's interesting is that it was a massive success. I mean, the bus ended up dying actually right here in Vegas, but all of us were happy we did it. It brought us closer together. People thought we would fight about it, but it actually brought us closer together. So I think somewhere in the back of my head, I had this idea that like, oh, when you buy property with friends, it works. And I'd always wanted an island. Like now what the yacht is to me now, the island always was. I always wanted to buy an island since high school. And finally found the opportunity to buy one in Canada. And at the time I would have rather purchased it myself because I just wanted to be, Tynan, king of the island. Like that was kind of my fantasy in my head, but couldn't afford it. So, and it was relatively cheap. It was under $100,000. So it's not like, I think people think islands are like millions of dollars. It really wasn't. Got 10 friends or 11 friends together to buy this thing. And it ended up hitting Hacker News. It was like one of the top things on Hacker News for a day. And it was very funny because everybody's like, it's going to be like Lord of the Flies. You're going to hate each other. It's going to be a disaster, like this whole thing. And, I was like, well, I don't know. We did the bus. It worked out well. I think it's going to be similar. And the island was an unqualified success. I mean, I think most of us would consider it the best money we've ever spent. It's like it brings a whole dimension to our lives we've never had before. I got to take my whole family there once, one summer for a week, which was amazing. And that was really the prototype. And what was interesting is that there were a lot of dynamics that we didn't know how they would work. Like some people are going to use it more than others. Some people are going to do more work than others. Is that going to make people angry at each other? And what we found was that it was the opposite because people who use it more do more work on it. And so the people who use it less, they're paying the same, but they're getting more for their money because they don't, there's people who've never been to, there's one person who's never been to the island. And he's like, yeah, I'll make it there someday. He's like, it looks awesome now. You guys have like, buildings and like furniture and stuff. My friend Brian, who goes almost as much as I do, this poor guy, he's been in the freezing cold water trying to save our dock from floating to the, the mainland, but he loves it. We have all these cool memories and projects. So after the island worked, I was like, all right, I've got a winning formula. Let me stamp it out. And so I forget what we bought after that. Maybe it was Budapest was the next one. And then we bought Hawaii. We took over a neighborhood in Las Vegas, not quite the same, but a similar sort of concept. And then we just got a place in Tokyo. That was our last one, maybe final one. I say it's the final one, but now I do have maybe some other ideas.
Is it always the same group of friends or do you bring like different people together?
So it's tons of overlap. I think there's like 4 people who are in on all or almost all of them. Very few people are in on only one. Maybe, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2 people are in on only one. Yeah, so it's very similar people.
And how does it work?
There's 2 people who are in on every single one.
And how does it work with, because like I said, the moment that I heard that you were doing this, I was like, oh, this is incredible. I need to do this too, because like one of my favorite locations, I think, is one that I think you really like. I am in love with Budapest. It's maybe my favorite city in the world. And it's definitely one that I want to own property in. But to me, it doesn't really make sense for me
you
to
got to
buy
hustle, man. Now's the time.
Yeah, everything's popping,
Yeah.
it's like it's
Yeah,
getting expensive, more expensive by the minute. But
it
how
is.
does it work? Like how do people share it? What are the rules of engagement, so to say, for the people who go into this property?
So what's interesting is that's the question I get most often, and it's also the one that is it's not even a factor. So it's like it's sort of like if somebody asked you as a frequent traveler, it's like, but how do you get all those visas? You're like, it just doesn't matter. Like you just get the
Right.
visas, right? Or you don't need them. For the island, I made all these rules. I had one of the guys who bought him was a lawyer, and so he looked it over. We had this big contract. We haven't even bothered to sign anything for the other ones because it just isn't a factor. What happens is you think that it's going to be the kind of thing where it's like, well, I don't want this guy to use it too much, or I don't, what if I don't get to use it as much? What happens in practice is that you want other people to use it more. Because like how much are people really going to go to Budapest, right? Or any of these places, even Hawaii, which is pretty accessible. People are there every month or so, I'd say, but not, it's not like it's booked. But most of the value is that you meet your other owners there and you hang out together.
Mm.
So I really think like if moving to like the root cause so you don't have any problems is pick the right people. And I think I would not do it without the right people.
How do you make sure that
And
you pick the right people?
yeah, so the the way I look at it is I have a super super close friends who are just in on all my weird schemes, and they're invited, right? And they were going to be invited from the beginning anyway. And part of why we're so close and part of why they're part of all these things is because I know that they aren't going to cause drama. They're like proactive enough that they're going to help out, but they don't, they're like the kind of people that could lead if you needed them to lead a project, but they're not like the kind of people that want to take everything over. Right. So you have a core group, maybe two or three friends. And I think most people in their life would like immediately like, oh yeah, my best friend Tom, he would be the one I would do it with or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Then for additional people, what I think is if the other people in the group were staying there and this person happened to stop by, would that be a net positive for that person? So I have really good friends who I don't invite to these things because I'm like, I don't know. Like maybe they would just get on each other's nerves for some reason, even though I get along great with them. I want to make sure everybody gets along, right? Another factor is that I make sure the properties are cheap enough that nobody will ever need the money back, right? So, for the island, it's like everybody had to put in under 10 grand. And so for some groups of friends, that's a lot of money. For other groups of friends, that's basically nothing. For us, it was like, I think for most people, it was like, yeah, it's significant, but like, it's not going to be the difference between can I buy my first home or not, for example,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that eliminates a lot of the drama. Um, and then I think the last thing is when I have these famous emails I send to my friends. It's like the Budapest hard sell, where it's like, here's a picture of Budapest. Here's what we're doing. Here's why. Here's what you need to do if you want to get in. It's like Budapest is the best. Here's what's great about it. All this kind of stuff. What I try to do is I try to really convey the vision for what the place is going to be. So I did this with the island because I think there's a lot of different things people could think of a private island as. And for me, it was like wilderness retreat. We're going to build it together. We're going to like go there to write. We're going to go there to program. We're going to like take hikes in the woods, like learn how to fish, like that kind of stuff. What I didn't want was somebody who thought this is going to be like Ibiza, right? And so like I'm trying to like build a rustic cabin. He wants to build like a nightclub, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so by sharing that vision, like here's what it's going to be like, that's going to weed out people who don't share that vision. So everybody wants the same thing. So we all work towards that goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. But how do you deal with like so you don't have any sort of rules in terms of like, hey, this one person has been staying in this place for 3 months, he's like over like he's using this way more than anybody else would be. Like how do you deal with like who pays for improvements? Like if something breaks, like does everybody chip
Yeah.
in to pay it? Like how does all that work?
Yeah, so we don't have strict rules against it around it, but mostly it's because we all just get along. So up until recently, I'd say there were no examples of that because most people have similar sort of like go for a week kind of things. But a friend of mine got a job in Hawaii. And so he asked me, he's like, hey, what do you think? Should I like stay there? Should I get my own place? And I was like, dude, just stay there. And then if somebody else wants it to themselves, you just get a hotel. So we have an informal rule, which I think actually, if I was doing it over and didn't know how things were going to go, I might make it a formal rule, which is that whoever uses it the most yields to others. So,
Mm,
for example, in Budapest, I was like, I was the only one using it in the beginning because I was setting it up and all this. And then a friend wanted to take his mom there at a time when I had already planned on going. And I said, look, dude, I'm 100% happy to go get a hotel. I'll meet you guys during the day. I'll show you around, and then you have it to yourself. I don't care. And he's a pretty easygoing guy. He's like, oh, we have extra beds. Stay with us and show us around. It'll be fun. But I wouldn't have minded. And so my friend who's there now, we have a little Facebook group, and he's like, hey, this is my plan. If anybody doesn't want me to stay there that long, tell me and I won't. No problem. And he's like, here's some plans I have for improvements. So uh, what did he do? He redid a lot of stuff in the kitchen, which needed to be done, and he's paying for it. And he doesn't have to. He's also the kind of guy who, like, after every after every island trip, I'm like, hey man, tell me your expenses so we can reimburse you. And he's like, I don't think I had any. I'm like, you paid for all of the lumber to build a dock. He's like, I don't remember that. So I think we just have very considerate people who, if they know they're using it more, they pay more. I do the same thing where, like, I don't reimburse myself for like a lot of expenses, and I try to just bring some of my own stuff and leave it there for people, like, stuff like that.
Do you think that your ability to pick and group the right people together comes from a lot of your experience from gambling and having to like read other people and sort of like the pickup thing where you can kind of tell who would mesh with who?
Certainly for pickup, right? Because like going back to that, like having a person simulator in my head, I feel like I can sort of do that. Um, I think a lot of it just comes from being pretty discriminating with who I hang out with.
Mm.
Um, at some point in my 20s, I became very busy. Like I just started working hard for the first time in my life. I didn't work hard for a lot of my life, and I realized that I didn't just have time to hang out with everybody. I had to like pick. And so it made me think, like, what do I value in friends? Who do I want to invest in terms of time? And so I think honestly, I just have a super amazing friend group where it's easy. I'm definitely playing
Gotcha.
on easy, trying to put together those groups.
Gotcha. One of the things that I'm picking up from talking with you is that you're an action taker, right? So I would say I have a lot of ideas, but I kind of tend to shoot them down. Like I have a lot of ideas of exciting things that I could do, and I end up shooting them down. Wow, it sounds like one of the differences between you and I'm sure there's many others, is that you kind of like take action on those ideas. Where do you think that comes from? Like, is that something that you trained yourself to do? Is it something that you think you were kind of like born with as a kid? And if it was something that you trained yourself to do, what are some things that the rest of us can do to also become better action takers on our fun ideas?
So I think I got lucky early in that I tried stuff like the school bus, which cost us each $300. So it's not like it was like a huge thing. But I think like I had some innate sense of like, if this doesn't work, then we've each lost $300. That's not. I'm a college student. That's a lot of money, but it's not going to like change my life. If it does work, it might be huge, right? I mean, think about that. To have a private school bus with your friends and like tour around the U.S. and have these memories could be huge. So, going back to what we we're talking about really early in this episode is that most people are bad at evaluating risk, and I think something I'm always looking for are asymmetric risks. Something where there's a fixed downside that I know I can manage, and an unlimited or a very, a high maximum upside. And not all of them will work out. I bought a Bentley that is sitting in my driveway totally inoperable, and I'm like desperately trying to sell this stupid thing. So it doesn't always work. But on average, if you stack up a lot of small losses with a lot of big wins, what does your life look like? And I think, we also live in a society where we think we have to ask for permission for everything, right? We're trained to ask for permission. And I don't know why I don't do that. I guess I got lucky. But a lot of time, I still remember the first time I stepped foot on our island, my first thought was like, somebody should really be stopping us from doing this. Like, this is insane that we just bought an island in another country and now we're actually like, this is my rock down here. Like it's, somebody should have stepped in and been like, this is a kind of stupid idea. Why are you doing this? And, I think maybe you've experienced that a little bit with travel when you're like, when, you travel to all these countries, you're like, why is nobody stopping me from having this insane life?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a subconscious thing. So I don't think people necessarily think that, specifically, but I think we have this thing where it's like, well, I don't know, nobody told me I could do that, or there must be a reason people don't do that.
Looking back, if you were to, ask your younger self, you know what I mean? Like when you were right about dropping out, and like, what do you think your younger self, when you're dropping out, would think about the person that you became and the sort of things that you're doing now?
I think he'd be relieved and absolutely blown away. I think I had a certain amount of goals back then, and I've certainly exceeded all of them by like an enormous margin, which probably means I wasn't that good at setting goals back then or whatever. But I think I've stayed like pretty true to the same principles I had back then. I think I've grown in ways that I hoped I would grow, and I think I've also like just done a lot of crazy stuff that guy could have never possibly guessed. Yeah.
Why do you say you said that he would probably be relieved? Why would he be relieved?
Uh, because I knew that I was taking risks, and it's the kind of thing where it's like a leap of faith, and I'm like, okay, I think this is going to work out, but it's not a risk unless you know it might not work out.
Mm,
And it's one of these things where I can believe something good is going to happen, but it sure is nice when it finally happens anyway. Um, yeah.
gotcha. Well, Tynan, listen, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. I've been super inspired by all of the amazing things that you've done. Like I said, I'm somebody who has a lot of interesting ideas, but I don't take action on them. And seeing you take action on like a lot of ideas has made me a lot more likely to do so. So I want to, thank you for, publishing and making all this public when you don't necessarily have to. You have the website tynan.com. You have all the books on Amazon, which I recommend people look at. And I know you recently started doing kind of like a weekly live show. Can you tell people about that? Where can they find out more about that as well if they want to join?
Sure. Yeah. So I started doing tea time with Tynan, but it's not about tea. Where I drink tea every morning, and now on Sundays I drink tea live on YouTube, and I answer questions from readers and viewers and stuff like that. Uh, and it's pretty cool. I've got like a really good community of people that end up getting to know each other. It's pretty laid back. I'll answer questions on a certain topic. I'll have guests there, and I have some pretty cool friends that I have as guests. Yeah, I think I should know these. I think YouTube, it's Tynan.com or Tynan.com or something. But I'm pretty easy to find. So it'll be this Sunday and most Sundays.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, man. I really appreciate it. And hopefully next time we're in Budapest, we can meet up or something like that. But always a pleasure to talk with you. And thanks so much, man.
Sounds good, man. My pleasure.